Voting Theory Class 12 Video 3. In this video I want to briefly talk about the history of gerrymandering. So where did it all begin? Gerrymandering, the word gerrymandering is sort of named after Elbridge Gerry, who was a Massachusetts governor in 1812. Gerry created a district in Boston that the newspapers at the time said looked a bit like a salamander. Okay, so he did some redistricting while he was governor, and the newspapers at the time said like it's a crazy shape, like it looks so stupid, it looks like a salamander. And then if you add the word Gerry and salamander, somehow you get gerrymander. I think like throughout history the pronunciation of his name changed. So he pronounced it Gerry, but now we say gerrymandering. Okay. And here's a picture the newspapers printed at the time. So he redrew these districts, and then the newspapers at the time were like, look how crazy the districts are. He's obviously doing this for like political motivation. It looks like a salamander or whatever. And at the time that was like a big insult. Okay, and it's really stuck throughout history. To be fair, from today's point of view, this districting doesn't look that crazy at all. I mean, if you were to Google gerrymandered districts, you'll see some really crazy pictures of like spidery districts that go in and out, and they have all sorts of tendrils, and they look like a complete mess. So compared to today's standards, this really isn't that bad of a district. Okay. So gerrymandering, it's always been a problem. Ever since like these elections were first held, like ever since this type of election was first held, people have probably been doing this sort of manipulation of boundaries. But in a lot of ways, it's becoming a bigger and bigger problem, and this is to do with the advent of technology. I mean, historically, like in Gary's time, when he gerrymandered this district right here, he sort of had to do all these calculations by hand. He didn't have supercomputers, and there wasn't big data on all of the constituents, right? Like nowadays, I mean, there are computers which can do trillions of calculations per second, and there's so much data available on voters that it's very easy to predict how people are going to vote, which means that with the use of supercomputers, politicians can gerrymander with pinpoint precision. Right? Whereas before this had to be a calculation done by hand, and that sort of limited how extreme you could gerrymander. But now there really isn't any limits apart from the limits of like what society imposes upon politicians, which currently is not a very strict limit. Okay. But that's the history of gerrymandering, and that's the end of this video.